What's up, my channel? Hello everybody, it is your friendly neighborhood sassy blonde writer here with another video for you guys. I don't want to talk about how much time I spent on my makeup to make this video, but I felt like looking pretty today. It's quarantine and I need a reason to look nice. Today we are talking about the unreliable narrator. So I was recently on Instagram and I saw a meme about an unreliable narrator and the struggles that come with writing one, and in the comments I noticed that there were people out there who don't know what an unreliable narrator is. It's kind of confusing idea as a writer to figure out what an unreliable narrator is and how to write one. When they're done really well, they're amazing stories to listen to. When they're not done really well, we all have that one person in our life, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a family member, who has a different memory of events than, say, everyone else in their life. You know exactly what I'm talking about. For example, let's say you have a friend who gets into an argument with some guy at a store when someone cuts them in line. You're there to witness the story, and you see it's just a little spat, and then everybody moves on with their lives because, you know, we're adults. And then by the time they tell the story at dinner to the rest of the family or the rest of your friends, they have somehow remembered it way more dramatic and inaccurate than, say, you do. Maybe they turned it from a brief little conversation to an all-out brawl where they were fighting with that person. They got boxing gloves. You know exactly who I'm talking about. Regardless of the reason why the details of the story don't match up with what actually happened, you know exactly who I'm talking about, and you've probably learned that whenever they tell you a story to just take it with a grain of salt and just understand that it's probably not what actually happened. If they say they stopped the train, they probably just talked to the conductor. Those types of people are all examples of an unreliable narrator. An unreliable narrator in literature is a first-person narrator with a compromised viewpoint. What does that mean? It means that the narrator of the story does not give an accurate depiction of what is actually happening. It's like a spectrum. On one side you have the facts, you have an unbiased opinion, impartial observations, people telling you things as they happen, etc. Then on the other side you have this character's version of what happened that's not very accurate. The most popular example of an unreliable narrator that you've most likely read in high school is The Catcher in the Rye. Holden Caulfield is an example of an unreliable narrator, and I'll go into details why. Another example is To Kill a Mockingbird. You'll also find these examples in movies as well. I'm going to go through all the examples. Today we are going to look at different types of unreliable narrators, why authors use it, and how you can try to do it in your own writing. Spoilers for the following: Catcher in the Rye, The Usual Suspects, Fight Club, Beautiful Minds, and How I Met Your Mother. I know you're probably surprised about that last one, and I will explain. I know when I first learned about what an unreliable narrator is, I had a lot of questions because it just kind of blew my mind. Usually, especially when you're reading a book, you just kind of assume what the character is telling you is the truth, especially if it's first-person narrator, because you usually don't have another viewpoint to give you any kind of check for what the character is doing. You don't really have someone calling out the first-person narrator on their BS typically. It's a lot easier to catch an unreliable narrator in film or TV shows because they will tell events. A lot of times filmmakers will have them narrate events and then show you what's actually happening. So it's a lot easier to figure that out while you are watching something than reading it, which is what is kind of fun about reading an unreliable narrator, but it also makes it kind of seem like a betrayal reading about an unreliable narrator. I couldn't wrap my head around the idea of a writer making their narrator say things that weren't true. And then you kind of go down this rabbit hole of, well, isn't everyone kind of an unreliable narrator? Answer is, well, kind of. You see, if you use first-person narrator, just like if somebody's telling you a story, you always run the risk of not giving an accurate depiction of what really happened. I mean, if you need an example of this, you could probably look at your diaries from your teenage years. Is it really the end of the world when Becca stops sitting with you at lunch? So if you were using a first-person narrator, you always run the risk of not giving the reader all the information because the person doesn't know it all. That's like dramatic irony right there. When you read a story in the first person point of view, general assumption is that you are being told the events as they happen, especially if it's present tense, you're kind of with the character on their journey. It's told in past tense. For example, in Kill a Mockingbird, Scout is writing this at age 12. She's explaining what she thought was happening when she was at 6 and observing the whole court case and all that fun stuff. So you get a little bit of reflection if it's an older person recollecting their memories as a child. You get a little bit more nuanced version of somebody a little bit older talking about something that happened as a teenager. So generally you assume that what the narrator is telling you is what's actually happening, or you can at least see their thought process and kind of follow along with what they're saying and see where they at least got to that conclusion. Also, typically a reliable narrator will have points in the story where they separate their own thoughts and actions and feelings about a situation from what is actually happening. In Jane Eyre, one of my favorite books, Jane frequently takes a moment to tell the reader her thoughts and feelings separate from what's actually happening. She goes through her reflections, she talks about her feelings, blah, 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 blah. In Jane Eyre, Jane is a credible and reliable narrator because while we are privy to her innermost thoughts, we generally take her to be a reliable observer because you get the idea that she can separate her own feelings about a situation from what's happening. That's the key to figuring out an unreliable narrator, both in real life and in fiction. The reader knows the first-person narrator becomes unreliable because of specific signals the author shows in the writing. This is the key to making a good, unreliable narrator. It's kind of a mystery that way, but the red herring is what the narrator is actually saying versus what's happening. A lot of times in books, the cues will come from an outside source. So a character that's not the narrator will make an observation. It could be a timeline thing. It could be an observation of how the narrator is acting, that sort of thing. So you have to keep your clues outside what the narrator is saying, which is what's going to signal to the reader, or at least when it's revealed they're an unreliable narrator, it's going to signal to the reader that they can go back and kind of trace that through. It's kind of like you're writing a mystery in a way because you want to leave your trail of breadcrumbs, but it's better if it's not completely obvious. How do you know when the narrator is unreliable? An unreliable narrator won't necessarily tell you that they're not giving you the full picture of what's going on. Sometimes it's because they're intentionally lying, and sometimes it's because they genuinely don't know that they're not giving you the full picture. Whatever definition of unreliable you're going with, there are always going to be key signs throughout the story, or that at least constitute or at least hint at the narrator's unreliability. For example, you have intertextual signs. Intertextual signs. The narrator is contradicting himself. That's usually the big one, or the other characters are contradicting them, like having gaps in memory or just lying to other characters. Spoiler alert for the Usual Suspects. For example, in The Usual Suspects, the narrator frequently changes what his story is and changes the details as he's telling it. And whenever the detective that he's talking to realizes this and calls him out on it, that's when the narrator will be like, oh no, wait, did I say Bobby did it? It's actually Frank, or whoever they're talking about. So that's a good example of an unreliable narrator. That is why there's that big plot twist at the end that he was Kaiser Sose all along. So a lot of times it'll signal to you because there's contradictions, and somebody along the line will call them out on the contradiction. So those are examples of intratextual signs. Extratextual signs, such as contradicting the reader's general world knowledge or impossibilities within the parameters of logic. So let me explain that a little bit. In Catcher in the Rye, we are frequently shown that Holden Caulfield's narrative contradicts what is actually happening. In fact, at the beginning, he even says, "I'm the most terrific liar that you ever saw in the world. It's awful. If I'm on my way to a store to buy a magazine and somebody asks me where I'm going, I'm liable to say that I'm going to the opera. It's terrible." So right at the beginning of the book, we see that he's unreliable and he's a prolific liar. Why would we believe anything he has to say after that? The other sign is reader's literary competence. This includes the reader's knowledge about literary types like stock characters that appear over centuries, and knowledge about literary genres and its conventions and stylistic devices. We see this frequently in stories like Huck Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird, where we as the reader have more life experience than, say, the children that are telling us this story. Huck Finn is literally a child who ran away from home. Kill a Mockingbird Scout is 6 when all of this stuff is happening. If you've ever been around a child when they're trying to tell you a story about what happens, you probably have heard them just make incorrect assumptions about things that are happening. So when the narrator is literally a child telling you a story, we as the reader, especially if it's meant for older readers, but it's a child narrating the story, we as the older readers have to do the heavy lifting when it comes to understanding what's actually happening, because the narrators are children, we are not. There are a lot of different kinds of unreliable narrators, a lot of which I've already hinted at, but we're going to go through the 3 basic types of unreliable narrators and some examples. So remember how I said it was a spectrum? So this one will probably be all the way over there. It is the deliberately unreliable narrator. These narrators are just flat out lying to you for whatever reason. These narrators are completely aware of the fact that they are deceiving the reader for a specific purpose. These are the people who actually lie, and they know exactly what they're doing. This type of narrator is intentionally lying to the reader because, well, they can. They have your attention, and the point of view is theirs, and they'll choose what to do with it regardless of responsibility they might have to the reader. They know that as you're reading, you only know what they're telling you. So they can just tell you and manipulate the events because you won't know any different. So an example of a deliberately unreliable narrator is, of course, in Gone Girl. Spoiler alert. In Gone Girl, Amy literally makes up a fake diary, which you read for the first half of the book. She makes up a fake diary for the police to read so her husband can get convicted of murder. She is literally lying to the police for a specific reason, and she is fully aware of the fact that she is lying. When you get to that point in the book, you feel, when you find that out, you feel super betrayed. She was literally doing that so she could pin the murder on her husband, because you read the book. It's a really good book. There's another example of a deliberately unreliable narrator in Gone Girl as well. In addition to Amy, her husband Nick is also deliberately lying to the reader for like the first third or half of the book as well, because he's having an affair that he conveniently leaves out, and at one point he addresses it in the book where he literally says, "Okay, I know you guys are gonna hate me, but I can't avoid telling you this anymore. I'm having an affair. I know, I'm the worst." Wow, the police sirens were very on point with the book I'm talking about. So he was literally leaving that out of the book because he didn't want the reader to be upset that he was cheating on his wife. Personally, I'm more upset that he lied to me than the fact that he was cheating. What's interesting about this kind of narrator is that people want to read about characters that they can connect with. So this is one of the tricky parts of writing this kind of narrator, and I have a link to an article that I read for this video that goes into more depth. Read that article down below. So one of the tricky parts about writing an unreliable narrator, this kind specifically, is the character has to be compelling enough and relatable enough that even after we find out they're lying to us, we're still invested in them. We will keep connecting with them, even if we suspect that they're lying to us. We don't necessarily like them, but we understand them. Another good example would be, when Walter White talks to his family throughout all of Breaking Bad, he is just lying through his teeth. But we as the audience know he's lying. We still want to know what happens. Think of these narrators kind of like propaganda machines. They know exactly what they're doing, and they're trying to manipulate you and in manipulating the facts, and they're trying to manipulate you into ignoring the truth or any type of logic, and you're just kind of along for the ride. Another example of this type of narrator is Barney in How I Met Your Mother, where he has some pretty crazy stories. About half of them aren't true. The second type of unreliable narrator we're going to talk about is the evasively unreliable narrator. These are narrators that unconsciously alter the truth. These types of narrators are a lot more fun to read. They're more difficult to write, however, because the reason that they're lying or the reason that they're unreliable is often quite muddy. Sometimes it's just self-preservation, where they're just conveniently leaving out facts that would make them look bad, and sometimes it's slightly more manipulative, and a lot of times this narrator will just frame a story differently than just telling you what happened. Sometimes this narrator isn't even aware of what they're doing or that they're twisting the truth until later in the book or later in the movie or TV show. Their unreliability often stems from the need to tell a story that justifies something, or their stories often are embellished if they need to make it more exciting, or watered down if what they did was kind of bad. A lot of times they're really just trying to tell themselves the story to make them feel better as they're telling you. Or they're kind of just manipulating the truth and they're not necessarily aware that that's what they're doing. These kinds of contradictory characters whose mindsets aren't clear can keep readers anxiously waiting for their narrator to realize that their moments of clarity, those are the books where you're kind of like, when are they gonna realize that this is the wrong thing to do? An example of this type of narrator is Ted Mosby in How I Met Your Mother. He frequently alters the truth, and the reason why we know that is Ted Mosby is telling the story to his children. Of course he wants to, gloss over those spicy details from his late 20s, early 30s. So we understand that he wants to water it down. And then we see him talking to his friends Lily and Marshall. We see him kind of do the same thing, where he'll either dramatize a story to kind of make him sound cooler, or he'll water it down to make him sound like he's not a bad guy, even though he does bad things. He frequently romanticizes his story, where he does some pretty crappy things to women, and he sanitizes what he thinks is inappropriate to his children so he comes off better. Why is he telling this whole elaborate story if most of it's really inappropriate to his children? Nobody knows. These are the people who end up in the r/that happened, because they're just telling the story and embellishing to make them sound better. The third type of unreliable narrator that we're going to talk about is the naively unreliable narrator. These are the narrators who are honest about what's happening, but they don't understand all of what's happening, so there's a lack of information overall. Unlike the previous two types of narrators, this type is not unreliable on purpose, which is what's kind of interesting to read. The narrator's unorthodox interpretations or just general lack of understanding the depth of what's happening might only provide us with partial explanations of what's going on, forcing us as the reader to dig a little deeper and do more of the heavy lifting to connect the dots in the story. We have no reason to believe that Scout is misinterpreting events or that she is withholding information from us, because her descriptions of the actions are straightforward and largely visual. For example, Mr. Tate blinked and ran his hands through his hair. His legs were crossed and one arm was resting on the back of a chair. The only indication of Scout's inability to understand the events is her faith that her father will win the trial. These naive narrators can also encourage readers to take more significant notice of things that we might have taken for granted. A really good example in film of an unreliable narrator is Forrest Gump. Forrest Gump narrates his life story, and his character is developed through misunderstandings that are clear to the audience, such as an Apple computer coming from being the fruit company that took off. We learn right off the bat that Forrest is very innocent. Forrest is an unreliable narrator, and we kind of learn that off the bat in the first 10 minutes that he doesn't really understand what's going on fully, so we as the viewer have to kind of do the heavier lifting. Next question is, Why do people use unreliable narrators? The short answer is it keeps the audience on their toes. Think about it. How compelling is it to read a book and know that they're lying to you and that you just kind of keep want to read to find out what actually happened? It's like an internal mystery. If you notice the contradictions, it makes you more curious about what actually happened and why the narrator isn't telling you the truth. It can also make for a really good plot twist. For example, in the ending of The Usual Suspects, reveals that the narrator has been deceiving another character, and hence the audience, you find out that he's been inventing these characters and events and just coming up with the names by looking around things in the room. And we all, not only do we find out he's lying, we also find out that he is not this weak and humble and quiet criminal that he presents as, but he's actually, in fact, Kaiser Sose, the film's fabled crime boss, and he killed all those people. In the 1999 film, Fight Club, we learned that he has dissociative identity disorder and that the events were completely made up, they were fabricated, which means only one of the two main protagonists actually exists and the other is in the narrator's mind. This is something that also comes up in Mr. Robot as well. That is the whole premise for the show. In the 2001 film, wow, unreliable narrators were really in the 2000s. In the 2001 film Beautiful Mind, it is eventually revealed that the protagonist has paranoid schizophrenia, and any of the events he witnessed occurred only in his mind. That's the big twist at the end. People also use unreliable narrators because it can create dramatic irony. Similar to the adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Huck can be an unreliable narrator, and his naive misreading of situations can create dramatic irony. He ends up in a lot of bad situations because he doesn't understand the full scope of what's happening, or that the characters he's interacting with are lying to him. Unreliable narrators can also be used to show character development. Another reason people use an unreliable narrator is because, like in To Kill a Mockingbird, having a child or innocent narrator can highlight and accentuate the cynicism and hypocrisy of adults. If you're going to write an unreliable narrator, the thing you need to figure out before you do anything is, what makes your narrator an unreliable narrator? Is it because of their age, like Scout or Huck Finn? Are they trying to manipulate you, like in Gone Girl? Are they just a liar, like Holden Caulfield? Is it the result of a psychological issue, like Mr. Robot or in Beautiful Mind? Or are they trying to get away with or justify a crime, like in The Usual Suspects? Or another example is Edgar Allan Poe's A Telltale Heart. One thing I definitely recommend is plant those seeds of the unreliable narration early on in your book, depending on how you want to do it. Because it's the same thing when you're writing a thriller. You want your reader to be able to go back to the beginning of the book, reread it, and see how they could have figured out that it was an unreliable narrator to begin with. That is what will separate a well-done unreliable narrator from a not so well done unreliable narrator. I also am linking to some articles down below with further tips on how to write one and more examples that goes a little bit more in depth than this video does. And I'm also including a link to a list of books with more unreliable narrators in addition to the ones that I've already mentioned if you want to study up on that as well. That's all I got for you today. If you want more content like this, please hit that like and subscribe button for more fabulous content from your sassy blonde writer. And of course, happy writing.